Thank you, everyone. Back in the old days, the web was a destination. It was a parallel universe. It wasn't really part of our world. In order to access this parallel universe, you had to use a wormhole. It's all very wonderfully sci-fi, but that wormhole was actually something fairly mundane. It was a PC. And we'd sit down at a desk, and we would log into cyberspace and all these kind of metaphors that go with that. And then when we'd had our go on the internet with its bleeps and its dial tones and 56K modems and all that, when you were done, you then turned the computer off, you stood up, and you got on with your day in the real world. And obviously, that's different now. The advent of pervasive networks and of cheap components has turned the web inside out. The web is now firmly part of our world. Millions of devices across the world act as a canvas for this digital world, bringing it very much into our daily lives. And so the old views that we had around the web and digital technology more generally, that it's mostly westernized, that it's desktop-bound, it's static, it's largely kind of techie kind of people, white-collar kind of people who would be using it, those views are obsolete. And now the web is surrounded by a whole host of new contexts, which force us to take a new look at how we design for them. Now, I'm aware that context is a fairly frustrating topic. It evades easy definition. And we tend to get tangled up in all sorts of knots. Well, what does context even mean? I don't really want to get too far into that, so I'll talk very briefly about what I think it is, or rather what it isn't. It isn't just about the physical surroundings. It isn't just about the here and now that surrounds the point of use, surrounds that point of interaction. Instead, it's all of the physical and digital and social structures that surround the point of use. Now, that's quite an expansive definition. And you don't necessarily have to agree with it, but I would urge you to recognize that context matters. Context is important. And I can give an example of this, which is sport. We find in pretty much every sport across the world that although the mechanics of the game is the same wherever it's played, a team playing at home has an advantage. There's some psychological, even there's physiological basis behind this to an extent, but it changes the outcomes of that particular interaction between the two teams or the two players and so on. It's context at work. Now, to understand the origin and impact of something like context, it takes a fair bit of patience and it takes a fair bit of insight. And I would say, as a community, I don't think those are our strengths yet. I mean, it makes sense. We're a fairly new field still. It's taking us a while to figure out the shape of what this thing means. But it means, I think, that some of the work so far, or some of the stereotypes that pervade around context, are fairly blunt. We fall back on generally two. The first is the desktop stereotype. And we're all familiar with this because, well, we've all been designing around it for many years. And in this stereotype, the user is sat comfortably at what we would call a traditional PC, a proper computer. The room is well lit, the pencils are sharp. We recognize that you might have a screaming kid or a ringing telephone that would distract from the user's concentration there, but generally we say that this stereotype is best suited for longer interactions, things like filling in forms or conducting slightly elaborate research. At the other end of the spectrum, this other stereotype that we rely on, probably too much, is the idea of the mobile stereotype. And here the user is out and about. They're in an unfamiliar setting. And for some reason, public transport is always involved. It's always someone running after a bus or trying to catch a train, that sort of thing. And in this mobile stereotype, this user is also perplexed, confused, distracted by the environment around him or her. And they use a smartphone in sporadic bursts, often to help them negotiate that unfamiliar territory. So we think of it as ideal for location-based services, for wayfinding, anything that gives snappy answers to very short, well-defined tasks. Now, there are, of course, some morsels of truth in those stereotypes. It's true that if you're static, it's easier to concentrate. And it's also true that smartphone users do snack on their smartphones, metaphorically, of course, through the course of a day. They do grout their lives by using smartphones. But I do think that these stereotypes are also fundamentally rather lacking. And I'll go through a few reasons why I think we need to go beyond them. The first is looking at the desktop context, which really doesn't hold up to much kind of rigorous analysis. The desktop context was never as homogeneous as it's purported to be anyway. If we just consider solely the physical environments that surround these supposed desktop contexts, we'll see that there's a lot of diversity there. Let's consider an illustrator's office. They might have a high-end Mac with a couple of large screens, graphics tablet, and so on. That's one desktop context. Or we might have a hurried single parent who's grabbed a bit of downtime on the sofa with a laptop. Now, it's easy to ascribe both of these people to that same stereotype, but the reality is they're probably going to interact with technology in significantly different ways. I would also argue that this idea of the desktop context is actually irrelevant, doesn't exist in some situations, or it's not a technological reality for many people. In a lot of countries, the web revolution, the digital revolution, has bypassed the PC. We have citizens whose first experience of the web is on a feature phone or on a smartphone. So a lot of those desktop connotations actually are fairly meaningless, even to millions of people. And of course, the mobile context is to me just as troubling. The devices that are frequently labeled mobile, which is a term I'll get onto a little bit later. I'm not a particular fan of it. But the devices we tend to call mobile, they're already too diverse to form a single category. People use smartphones and laptops and feature phones and netbooks and tablets and consoles in all sorts of different scenarios. So I can fashion myself a kind of desktop-like experience with my iPhone and a Bluetooth keyboard. I can pair together and put a little stand in, and hey presto, I've got what we would think of as kind of a laptop-y setup. I actually wrote some of this talk when I was on a train, sort of bumbling through the fields of southern England. And this mobile idea comes with a number of conclusions that I think are not necessarily valid. For instance, we always think that a mobile user is going to be on 3G connection. It might be quite flaky and so on. But there's a survey by NTT Docomo that found that 60% of smartphone data was actually used indoors, frequently in very close proximity to a PC or a TV and so on. This whole idea of context being this static, knowable state in which activity happens, there's even a question as to whether that's the right way to look at this. There's an academic by the name of Paul Durish who's written extensively about context, and he says that we're using the wrong model here. That whole premise is flawed. So it's not this stable, knowable state. Instead, context is emergent. So it's the activity itself that creates and sustains context. And that means it's volatile. It's based on the consensus, the agreement of everyone who's involved in that interaction. So as an example, I might be having a work conversation which suddenly becomes inappropriate for that context if a manager walks in or if it gets onto a very particular risque topic. So to make truly excellent products that understand context and use it to our advantage, we need to look deeper than these two simple stereotypes. And for me, the way to do that is we have to investigate things firsthand for our particular products. And I think there are two main routes for doing this. The first is to gather data using our device and then use that to try and understand the context of the user. Because our devices are these wonderful marvels of sensory technology. They can speak to us in ways that they never could before. So obviously, it makes sense that we should listen to what they're saying. So the idea here is we can gather data, these fragments of sensory data like motion or temperature or location and so on, and hunt for patterns within that data, and then piece together the context of the user from that. And I think that's a very appealing notion. It's relatively easy to capture, although of course it depends. It's a little bit easier perhaps if you're running a native app has access to more of that kind of device-level stuff. And there's also an undeniable wow factor if you get it right. It has that kind of magic property that a lot of people are trying to capture. However, I do think implying context from data is quite dangerous. It's quite a risky activity. And the main reason for that is, of course, that data can't assure us of intent. Just because I'm at a cinema, in fact, I'm at one today, doesn't mean I'm here to see a film. I may be giving a talk or I may be conducting a health inspection. So if we make these assumptions, if we stack a few of these up, then the risk of error increases with every fresh assumption that we introduce. It's very likely, in fact, that we'll end up getting it completely wrong. There are also other issues we need to consider with this kind of thing, particularly privacy. If we imply users' location data or something quite sensitive from the data that their device is giving off, does the user know about this? Have they given their informed consent to that? How do they opt out of that? These are important questions that we have to address if we're considering this stuff. Now, I'm not saying that implying context and learning from sensory data is useless. Far from it. It can be very valuable. But it is dangerous when it's your only source of insight. Because I think the context really is too subtle, it's too human to be left to machines. You have to take some time to research the user and research their context yourself. And so this second route of learning from research, that trades in those sort of assumptions for knowledge. And that gives you more confidence in your decisions, and it encourages empathy and curiosity, I think, among product teams. When it comes to research, there's no prescription for the one right approach. There are instead a number of established tools that any design researcher will be able to tell you about. Again, this isn't the place to go into them in huge detail. There are entire books, entire libraries built on this stuff. But let me just jump through a couple. I think it's tempting to start with some of the quantitative measures like surveys and analytics and so on. And again, that can be helpful, but because context is this qualitative art, you'll find that the details of context will sometimes slip through the gaps between numbers. So I think you always need to pair that kind of thing with more qualitative techniques. So two I tend to rely on significantly. One is face-to-face interviews, and the second is contextual inquiry. An interview is relatively simple. You simply sit down and talk with your potential users, and you will have a script that you'll have prepared up front, but you'll be prepared to deviate from it whenever you come across particularly interesting topics. And these are great for understanding people's motivations, their priorities, particularly their language. And you can figure out how best to try and tailor the product that you're developing, that you're designing, around the needs that they've expressed. And if you're very good at it, you can actually start to get at the core of maybe some of those unexpressed needs as well. Clearly, this could tell you some contextual information too. Ask them to walk you through a particular interaction. Well, how do you go researching holidays, for instance? You can gather that sort of information through an interview and learn more about the contexts that your app, your product will be used in. Contextual inquiry just takes this a bit further. It's a fairly elaborate name. In essence, it's just shadowing someone as they actually complete the task. It's great for work-based scenarios. If you're building a business-to-business tool, for instance, you can act as a neutral observer and simply watch people use an existing product or your own product that you want to improve. And this tells you a whole ton about context. You see the environments around them. Are they noisy? Are they bright? Are they busy? Have they got post-it notes with passwords stuck all over the place? That kind of thing. But you don't need to go quite so formal with this. It can take a little while to really get stuck into contextual inquiry. So you can do stuff that's far less formal than that. You can, for instance, observe the general public. If you're building something for mainstream consumption, let's say you're building a shopping app that allows people to make shopping lists for the supermarket. Well, hang out in the supermarket. Lurk and just watch people, stalk them in a nice way. See what they're doing. Are they making lists? How are they keeping track of what they've got in there and what they need to get and so on? You'll find, if you do this kind of contextual inquiry, that people interact with their environments in quite surprising ways. All sorts of ingenious little hacks tend to emerge that you probably won't have considered. You can also do this in social media. You can spend time in forums, do searches and social media services and so on, and then try and immerse yourself better in that community. You'll understand the language, the patterns of interaction that happen, and so on. Understand the mindset, and the contexts will tend to emerge from that kind of analysis. Finally, you might want to look at something called a diary study. This is what's known as a longitudinal piece of research because it lasts possibly a couple of weeks. That means it's very suitable for complex long-term decisions like, say, buying a car or something like that, or weight loss. It takes its name from the practice of giving the participant a diary and asking them to fill it in once a day, for instance. But you don't need to be so literal. You could ask them to take photographs of any used car adverts they come across that day, or when they are shopping in the supermarket, snap what's in your shopping trolley as you leave. Take a picture. Is your family with you? Just helps to surface that kind of contextual knowledge. Now, all this kind of research, it's going to tell you about a ton of stuff way beyond just context. It's going to tell you things that will help you determine your product strategy, the devices you want to support, the marketing planning that you want to undertake, and so on. But I'll just focus here on the different types of contextual information you might spot through research and through implying from data on the device. The different types of contextual information that you'll see, and then what they might mean. And I call these the 7 flavors of context. Now, I'll confess that when we're talking about something that's, an abstract noun, like context, it's impossible to perfectly classify it. And inevitably, sometimes the categories will melt into each other a little bit. But I will say, if you've considered each of these 7 flavors of context, then you can be pretty confident that you've given due attention to the most significant factors, most significant contextual factors that are going to have an impact on the way your product is used. So the first flavor I'll talk about is the device itself. Now, there are some features of the device, the input methods used to interact with it, the screens, the size of the screens, and so on, the capabilities that it has with regard to networks and so on. Those are probably so important that they need different talks, and it's been good to hear a couple of other people have picked up those threads here today. What I'll do here is I'll just focus on how the form of the device, the industrial shape of the thing, and some of its capabilities can affect context. Now, designers, we used to have it relatively easy when we started thinking about the form of objects, of products, because we could always fall back on the adage that form follows function. Well, that doesn't really hold anymore. That doesn't work in the 21st century. Because our machines are no longer mechanical, they're digital, there's not that much correlation between the shape of something and what it does. So I could launch a rocket with my smartphone, or I could have an enormous supercomputer that's just beating me at chess. So the number of potential forms for technology has exploded. Back in, I think it was 1991, Mark Weiser, who's pioneer of what we now call ubiquitous computing, he proposed a number of different forms that could sprout up in the coming decades. And the 3 that he named were tabs, pads, and boards. And there are good mappings, actually, between those 3, tabs, pads, and board, to our current categories, as we would call them, smartphone, tablet, and TV, or something, some kind of big wall-mounted screen. Dan Saffer, who's an interaction designer based in San Francisco, he's recently extended Weiss's vocabulary there, his categories to include dots, which are very small, sort of a couple of centimeters. I'm thinking maybe like the Pebble watch. That might map well to that kind of category. Boxes, these are non-portable devices, maybe sort of toaster size. Chests, large, heavy things. I'm probably thinking white goods, washing machines, that sort of size. And then vehicles, which obviously makes sense. Now, it's definitely safe to say that not all of those are relevant right now. You can't run, Chrome on a dot or on a washing machine at the moment. But the web's going to start to materialize in all sorts of unexpected places. Now, of course, some of these devices are going to be better suited to some of these tasks. We could see, for instance, that although I'm not going to browse a complex web app, or as Jeremy might call them, a website, on a dot, on a wristwatch, it could still check me into a location-based service. It could still act as a screen reader, reading me headlines from a news service, and so on. So although there are going to be some of those forms that are particularly relevant to specific tasks or specific types of product, there will still be the potential for people to be experiencing your service across all of those different forms of the device. It's also worth asking, well, what can those devices that we're considering, what can they actually do? What capabilities do they have? And particularly, I'm thinking around what does the operating system allow? What functions are there on that device? This provides a sort of software context, if you like. So what applications are there that might interact or interrupt, interact with your app or get in the way, like a phone call might come in, displace the user from their current task? Well, how can you design something if users are on that device? How can you help them recover their kind of mental state and their state within the app when that happens? Another example, which obviously we've all had to face fairly recently, is file handling. We're used to a certain style of file handling in the desktop PC market, the laptop PC market. A lot of smartphones and tablets and so on have significantly reduced file handling capacity, so we need to figure out ways to allow people to manipulate files without access to that kind of hierarchy that existed previously. Finally, the operating system itself is loaded with a ton of expectations and conventions around how it should look and behave and then feel to the user. So how do you design to make sense for that particular operating system? Well, if you're building a native product, then of course you need to try and follow the UI conventions of that platform, the interface guidelines and so on. If you're trying to build something to be experienced across a number of devices, a number of platforms, then of course you need to be a bit more careful. Because if you try and mimic one platform, you will alienate the other. And I'm sure anyone who's worked on an iPhone app and an Android app is aware of the dangers of just trying to port your iOS design into the Android language, because one thing's for sure, users know of that trick and they don't like it. They want an Android app to feel like an Android app. But if we're trying to build a web app that's accessed across all of these, then it's dangerous to try and mimic the native conventions, because it's going to introduce a heck of a lot of complexity in your process. You have to reverse engineer some very sophisticated interaction design, some visual design, and you're at the whim of the change, of any change that happens at that OS level as well. So you're always behind. I would say if you really want a native feel, build a native app. Don't try and do that with a web app. The web is far better at celebrating the diversity of the different products and devices that can access it, and that's its strength. Cater to that, not trying to get too locked in to the behavioral specifics of one platform. So the second flavor of context is probably a bit more of an obvious one. This is the environment around us. And as our device forms have exploded, a lot more portable devices specifically, this flavor is becoming far more relevant to us. One of the first things to consider is if your product, whatever you want to call it, is likely to be used outdoors, then that's just another little facet to consider. You might have cold weather, for instance. If you're building something to be used in the northern Scandinavia, for instance, then just expect users to have cold hands, or they might be wearing gloves. Or let's say they're going to be using it in the Mediterranean, it's like a holiday app or something like that, then you're likely to have sun glare, and so perhaps you might want to tweak the color contrast, the font sizes to improve legibility in these kind of low contrast conditions. And obviously, that's good news anyway in terms of legibility, readability, accessibility of the things you're building too. But it's not just around the interface specifics. The weather is also going to affect the task that users are undertaking themselves. So I play a little bit of golf very badly. If it's snowing, I'm not going to be booking a tea time at my local course, but I might well be booking local practice facilities. Also consider the noise and the light within the environment as well. Let's say we have an app that's designed to be used in an environment like this one. It's dark, it's relatively quiet. If I'm designing for this, well, I'm going to try and understand that and not contribute to some negative pollution. I don't want to create a noisy app or an app that's, say, full of very bright images, which is going to cause light pollution, and so on. So it's just about understanding more about the noise and the lights that are going to happen in that environment around people. It's just doing your part, really, these subtle touches to show that you've been considerate towards your user base and the context they're likely to use the services in. The environment may also house information. I mentioned previously, I've been on shadowing contextual inquiry visits previously, and I've seen people with, trying to conduct sales, but with a tattered old printed price list that they haven't got digitally, so they have to consult that. Well, it's essential for that user flow, for that task, to have that information close to hand. So how can we take advantage of that, or how can we design with that knowledge in mind for what we're building. Now, when it comes to environmental context, I think it's quite easy to get carried away. You start getting excited, and you start thinking, well, we've got these light sensors, and maybe if it's more than this luminosity outside, then we can do this, or have a dark theme that kicks in automatically. The reality is that you don't need to worry about it that much. The user is going to take charge of most of these environmental issues his or herself. If it's extremely bright, they're going to shield the screen, or they're going to turn up the brightness, that kind of thing. If it's raining, they'll probably clean. You don't have to worry about it too much. Don't try and make something that's so fussy about the environmental details, particularly because they're quite opaque. We may not, as humans, we may not even notice that subtle change in light that's caused the app to suddenly go into a different color. Instead, it looks arbitrary, it looks weird. You don't understand why the app is responding in that way. So instead, with this flavor of context, really, it's about trying to make a subtle and understated difference through considerate acts. The third flavor I'll talk about is time. And we're starting to see some early patterns emerge. Now, some caveats around this data, but it seems that certain classes or certain types of device are more likely to be used in certain ways in different times throughout the day. So far, it seems that tablets have relatively high leisure use in the evenings and so on. Desktop PCs tend to have a bit of a peak in office hours. Smartphones, a bit more stable across the day. Particularly during periods of user downtime, so commutes, we see spikes in them as well, and also personal use during the day, potentially if they're outside corporate networks as well, that sometimes has an impact. Also consider at what times of the day is the product you're building most likely to be used, and also what else is happening right then. Are there other relevant activities? Lunchtime, well, people might be eating lunch at the time. They might get, food crumbs and sauce and all this all over the thing. If you're cooking a cooking app, then what are the activities that happen simultaneously to that, and try and consider the impact they're likely to have on your design. We can also try and use the knowledge of time to enhance the functionality of a service. So some obvious examples of this would be a news service that gives you its freshest content, or a timetable that says, well, rather than this entire list, here's the next train that's coming up, or a hotel that advertises last-minute vacancies. It's all pretty obvious stuff. And finally, it's also worth considering how much time does the user have available. And this is the sort of thing that your research is going to be particularly well-suited to discover. You'll generally find that complex interactions need a long period. So if it's American tax returns, right? I've seen those forms, I've dealt with them. That's something you need a long time. You need like a day set aside to it. So if you are designing a service that allows people to kind of chip away at this piecemeal, then give them progress indicators. Allow them to save state and to return to that point later. Tell them that you're 6% through, your estimated completion time is 7 a.m. at this rate, or whatever it might be. Basically, you're trying to, through feeding people information, allow them to understand and to choose whether now is the right moment to tackle that task, or whether it's something they should put off until they have more time available. The next flavor of context I want to talk about is activity. And this is really just, what do the users even want to do anyway? In early human-computer interaction, there's this notion that the user has normally a single, fairly well-defined, fairly clear task. Later research and later practice has found it's not always quite that simple. We find now that people use the web, of course, with no specific goals in mind a lot of the time, or at least a complex set of fairly hazy goals that we can't really reduce in the same way. Many activities, for instance, they take place across multiple visits, some of which may be at home, some of which may be on the move, and so on. It's a fairly complex network of activities these days. Your research is going to help you identify the nature of that task and how best you can support it then. There are obviously some types of activities that suit some types of interaction. For instance, if someone is using an app or a product or whatever it is to support some kind of physical activity like cooking or wayfinding, they'll probably be using a handheld device, a portable device that it's not likely they're going to lug up with a 27-inch iMac and smack it down in the kitchen. However, if that task is sufficiently important to them, they'll use whatever technology they have to hand. Now, I know two people who've written entire books on the New York City subway, not just in a single trip, of course, but over the course of a year or something like that. I've also seen reports, seen interviews with one that sticks in mind, an African entrepreneur who wrote his business plan, his 8,000-word business plan, on a Nokia feature phone, because that's what he had. Now, for us, that's a horrifying notion that can't be well suited to it. But if that activity is sufficiently important, people use whatever they can find. Another interesting way you might want to scrutinize activity is through a spectrum of lean back and lean forward. So this is it an active task, like filling in a tax return, for instance, where I provide information? Or is it more passive, flipping more idly through holiday photos, for instance, that kind of thing? Now, I think historically the web has been skewed fairly lean forward. But there are a lot of interesting lean-back use cases starting to emerge. Vimeo has a couch mode where you don't really have much interface. It's mostly just feeding this content toward you. There's also the idea of glanceables, which I'll just touch on very quickly, just because I find them rather interesting. A glanceable is a single-purpose, low-density app that pushes information into the environment. I've heard them called information radiators, which I think is a really nice phrase. This is a glanceable by James Darling, who's a technologist who was at Berg, a London design studio. And he'd used Transport for London data and mashed it up a bit and created a service that gave him timetable information on a Kindle. And he was saying, well, the Kindle is perfect for this because it's unobtrusive, doesn't bleed light into the environment. It just sits there using its e-ink display. It's passive. It doesn't consume any energy, really, when it's in that kind of state. It's perfectly at home. It's part of the world again. It's not shouting for attention. So I think it's fascinating to consider the applications of this sort of lean-back style and how we can try and design better around it. The next flavor of context is the individual, him or herself. It's not just about the abilities and the dimensions and the limitations of the human body. That whole ergonomics thing is, again, a talk in its own right. Clearly, that stuff is important. We've all heard, even today, about touch target sizes and so on. Henry Dreyfuss was really the godfather of this kind of anthropometrics. But I'll talk more specifically here around the context of the individual. Their personality, their state of mind, their preferences, their emotional state. Now, this stuff's obviously very hard to understand. It's pretty much impossible to understand through sensors. This is, again, another thing where you need to get research and get actually that personal connection to understand more about people's approaches here. So the form factor of the device, I think, it doesn't just change the capabilities of that device, but it has subtle impact on the nature of the relationship that we have with that device. So, as an example, there's a field of study called proxemics. I think it's a psychologist by the name of Edward T. Hall who started this thing up. And really, it's research into the perceptions of personal space. And he found different zones of space. There's a public zone and a private zone, an intimate zone, and so on. And Hall found that the zone, 18 inches or so from us, is reserved for our closest friends, our family, our lovers. It's a very intimate space that we don't let others into. Well, we let smartphones into that space. And I think it's interesting to sort of extrapolate from that and say, well, maybe that's one of the reasons that we feel we have such an intimate connection with this technology, because we always keep it so close to us, whereas desktop PCs and large displays and TVs and so on are at arm's length or even further. We can also look at the preferences and the dislikes that the users themselves have. Now, we may have some information around that from their previous behavior. They may have said, well, I need to turn off this because I don't like it in this screen, and so on. They may customize the interface. They may also have these ambient signals like click-throughs, so we can understand the sort of content they're more interested in, or previous purchases if you're running some kind of e-commerce app and so on. But again, try and learn what you can around the preferences of your user base. And this will be something you'll have to find out in aggregate. You're not going to be able to tailor that on a one-to-one basis. But again, look for patterns that may exist. Finally, what mental attitudes do people bring to that interaction? Are they excited to be using this service? Are they nervous? Are they annoyed? Again, coming back to the tax example, they're probably likely to be certainly annoyed. Again, your research is going to be invaluable to try and pick out this kind of information. Last two flavors to go through then. Location context is rather easier to get a handle on it. Particularly, it's quite easy to detect. We have the technology to do that, and we have, obviously, the geolocation API, which allows us to get this kind of information into our web products. And the geolocation API, in essence, works. You ask the device to report its position by whatever means it has available. Normally there's some sort of hierarchical stack. It will look for a GPS or an IP address or maybe MAC address, cell phone networks, or it might fall back to user input and you say, well, I'm in Nottingham, UK, or whatever it might be. And that outputs a long lat pair and an accuracy value and things like that. There's still some work to do then. You have to turn that long lat pair into something human readable and meaningful. Rather than a string of numbers, it's much more useful to know that actually, well, I'm on the 7th floor of Harrods or whatever it might be. Now, when it comes to looking at location context, one of the most important questions that I ask is this a habitual location for the user, or is it a mobile location? So I said I'd talk a bit more about mobile, and here's the way I look at this. That mobile is actually quite a harmful term because it's conflated, it's used in so many almost contradictory ways. For me, mobile refers to a person. It refers to a human being. It's a user location state. It's not a device category. It's not accurate to say a device is mobile unless it's being carried by a user in a non-habitual location. Some devices are definitely more portable than others. But a 27-inch iMac could be portable. It could be mobile if I'm taking it with me somewhere. It's kind of a very unlikely use case, but you never know. So I think the choice of device and the user's current location, yes, there's going to be some correlation there, but don't make these oversimplifying assumptions. Again, do your research, get out there with people to understand what they'll be using and where. I mentioned previously the mobile stereotypes that we have. Now, it is true that people in unfamiliar surroundings tend to have local information needs. Bing, a year or so ago, said that something like 33% of the mobile searches, or the searches from what we call mobile devices, smartphones and feature phones, and I guess tablets as well, that 33% of those searches were related to location. So do users have location-specific needs for your product, given what you know about where they're using it? But don't make the mistake of restricting that kind of opportunity, that kind of potential to smartphones, tablets, and so on. Desktop browsers, of course, have just as significant location capabilities via the geolocation API and so on. So if someone's saying, well, where's a good place to eat around here, then that's an entirely valid question to ask, even if you're in the office. So don't just restrict it to a certain class of devices. Now, location's interesting because obviously there are huge opportunities here, but the thoughtless use of geographical information can be quite dangerous. Again, privacy implications become quite strong here. The geolocation API spec, I believe I'm right in saying it's explicit that the user must give their permission before that query is even run. Usually that's a confirmation dialogue. We're all familiar with the iOS pop-ups or Google Chrome at the top of the bar, the deny or allow bar there. So because you're asking the user, are you OK with us accessing this information, they've got to understand why you need it. And it's frustrating to me as a designer to use services that when the first time you open the app or you visit the site, it says, well, the first thing I want to know is, where are you? Well, why? Why do you need to know that? So you need to explain the value of that request up front. If you're just gathering it for out of an idle interest because it's valuable, then change your mind very quickly about that, because you'll find a lot of disengagement, a lot of people kind of rejecting or declining that request. You'll probably even find yourself contravening data protection laws in the EU for that sort of thing. So consider very carefully, is access to location going to really improve that service? If it is, explain why at the point at which you ask for the user's permission. The final flavor of context that I'll talk about is social. The most obvious social context is who else is nearby, who is part of the interaction. Is this an app that's going to be used in a solo context, or is it going to be more of a group activity or even a public activity? And then the other things that we're designing for, are they appropriate for that context? You can think of clear examples on both sides. A banking app, for instance, that displays my bank balance is probably not something I want on a big screen like this. I'd rather have it on a very personal screen. Who else is involved in that interaction as well? And this isn't just around the people who are standing next to me or in close proximity. It's also people who are involved in the broader task. Another example here, let's say I'm looking for a holiday. I might want to consult with my girlfriend before I just go ahead and book it. So there's a long process that would involve her, may involve consulting our calendars, may involve me talking to work to book time off and so on. Who are the other actors in that scenario? And again, how does that affect our design decisions? And finally, just have a think about the likelihood of people sharing devices. Now, this isn't something that's terribly common in the West, in Europe, in North America. We do find that desktop PCs, for instance, and particularly tablets, seems to be there shared more commonly between family members. But in emerging markets, the idea of sharing a feature phone is extremely common. And you'll find that there are mobile manufacturers and operators and so on looking to design around that and provide that kind of granular level of control where there's, say, a village that has access to a couple of smartphones and then there's a user-level login. So just consider, well, what are the privacy implications? Do we need to offer a way to clear search history if someone else is going to be using that device and that app? Do we need to let people switch between accounts quickly? What do we need to do around logout and so on? So those 7 flavors of context, potentially quite hard to remember all of them. The good news is the first letter of each of these flavors of context spells this handy acronym, details. And this is something that you can use as a shorthand to guide your research and just to be sure that you're asking the right questions around context. And so you can pass that kind of information and ask these interesting questions of the rest of your team as well as of your users. So just to wrap up then, I'll just spend a couple of minutes talking about some general design principles that you can take from considering context. Now, clearly, you're going to have your own responses, your own answers that come from your research and the specific issues of your projects. But some general principles here just to wrap up. The first is that context is very multifaceted. Different flavors of context will dominate at different times or different points of use. Coming back to Paul Dorish again, he said that context is fluid. It's something that's constantly renegotiated between people. So you'll find that not all of those flavors of context will be important at any one point, but that at some point they're probably all relevant. So consider the longitudinal approach. What happens not just on the first run, but the 12th run, the 100th run? What are the likely different flavors that will dominate? And again, this comes down to your research, also your intuition, and particularly testing, getting the thing in hands of people, and understanding when it's working with their context and when it's not. As a rule of thumb, I would say if a flavor of context doesn't significantly affect behavior, then you can probably ignore it. Make fairly small changes and then see where that gets you. Don't punish users for their choices, because they may not actually be choices per se. They may be imposed upon the user, as I was saying in the case of the gentleman writing a business plan on a feature phone, because that's the technology he had available. So there's this kind of philosophy behind it that I'm sure we're all familiar with, that the user should have access to the same functionality and the same content, whatever their context. And that includes their choice of device, for instance. Coming back to this whole thing of making sure that you have access to the same content, we don't strip content out unnecessarily in certain contexts. Now, for that, you really need to understand and define the core product, something that Dan Saffer, who I mentioned before, he says, well, what's the Buddha nature of your product? And then remove functionality or content only if it's absolutely necessary, for instance, for a security purpose or because it offers a genuine improvement to the user experience. So it's best to think of context as additive, how you can use it to add power. It's not an excuse to subtract power. Because it's so subtle and so human, you need to respect that. The assumptions that you do make should be gentle, they should be quite mild. It's very exciting to imagine all sorts of ways that you can surprise and delight people when you start thinking about contextual applications, but it's also very easy to get carried away. Your most sophisticated algorithm is still not going to interpret context accurately much of the time. Instead, just look to improve the humanity of your product. And be gentle. Otherwise, as I say, your app becomes unwieldy, it starts to behave almost with a life of its own, and when the user doesn't feel in charge of that process, then suddenly you have problems. If you do have to make significant changes because of the user's context, then inform the user and allow them to override that decision. So again, a fairly mundane example, if you must remove functionality from an M.dot website or web app, then at least offer the opportunity through I hesitate to call it a desktop site, given everything I've said, but let's call it a large screen version. So at least they can access that technology, that functionality. Even though it may be more complex, it may not be the optimal context for it, the user can still get things done. Finally, make sure that you revisit the decisions that you make. Context will always be a slippery thing because the whole idea of context itself is changing. So we need to improve the shelf life and the sustainability of our product. So we need to think about flexibility and particularly emergent use. How will people be able to make their own uses for the things you're building? Because obviously, as a Twitter example, a lot of the functionality and features of that have emerged through user convention, and we've built around those. Now, although these 7 flavors of context, I think, are relatively timeless, there are still some permutations that are going to be, within less than a decade, which will just blow our socks off. We can never anticipate what the potential contexts of use are going to be like in that kind of period. So it's important that you stop periodically to readdress contextual issues, to build these flexible systems that can be traversed in new and exciting ways. So all it takes is, on our part, a willingness to experiment and to consider these things that are otherwise quite easily ignored. And then we can see what these new forms of context mean for the future of technology. It's pretty much everything I have to say up here. This URL has a very thorough write-up of this talk. It also has a ton of reading resources, several dozen links and articles and papers and so on around context. So that, if you're interested, is probably quite an interesting read. And thanks for your time.
Thanks. I think we got time for a couple.
Great.
So you started one of the things you'd kind of talked about a little bit at the end, but it had come up from a few people in the audience, so I still wanted to bring it up just to make sure that was clarified, was the idea that like context when it comes to, so for example, we're getting advanced APIs and access to different things like, ambient light and all of these kinds of things. But because context is such a human thing, is it ever really safe to make those optimizations based on that criteria alone, or is there always need to be some sort of an in-between?
On those criteria alone, no, never. It's not safe to do that. I mean, even just something as silly as ambient light, you don't know if that's sunlight or whether it's someone's, a policeman shining a torch in their eyes. And,
Right.
there are just so many real-world scenarios that might cause that kind of thing. People jump to that stuff as soon as they realize that APIs are being built around it and these devices have the potential to do it.
Oh, sure, it's exciting.
It's definitely exciting. It's glamorous. It's kind of sexy because, well, think of the great things we can do. But I think once you start to analyze it on any kind of rigorous level, you also realize, well, imagine the harm we can do or the incorrect assumptions we can make. So on their own, useless, but combined with a slightly more methodical approach to research, then by all means, see where you can add value there.
And I like the emphasis you put on treating them as, again, as enhancements, not like removing, completely altering the experience, but just kind of enhancing the experience if you do get a little bit of information. Do you have examples of anybody that's doing it really well?
There's one that springs to mind. As I mentioned, I play a bit of golf, not very much anymore, but this is an app called Golf Shot, and it just uses GPS. I mean, at its core, it is a GPS reliant service in that you walk to your ball and it tells you how far you've got to hit it to get the hole right. It's using Google Maps and all sorts of stuff. And it's kind of useful because then you know which club to use. But it engages certain modes depending on where you are. If you are at the course, then it will be in a different mode than when you're reviewing your scores. Yeah, it gives you statistics on how many shots you took with a certain club and all that sort of stuff. So I think it uses location context very intelligently. Foursquare is an example I give quite a lot as well. Actually, the Foursquare website, I have a screenshot on the post up there, which does a great job of explaining the location context and the social context and the time context of why it's giving you certain recommendations for where to go for dinner. So I think they're certainly one of the more sophisticated.
And a lot of these examples, naturally, are for very task-based kind of applications or websites or whatever you want to call them. Are there implications for more of like a content delivery site?
I've been thinking a bit about what Jeremy's been saying about the web app versus website dichotomy. And I'm maybe coming around slightly to his point of view that even though we can consider it a more content delivery kind of mechanism, there's still a task behind that. There's still, I want to learn more about something, even if it's something trivial, like I need to know what's on telly next or when the Rocky and Bullwinkle show is on or whatever. Sure. So I think you probably could see applications working across, right the way from something complex like TweetDeck all the way down to what we would consider a more straightforward information-giving service. You can certainly see some of those techniques would apply as well.
Yeah, to Jeremy's point too, with I know where he stands on that. The border between app and site has always been awful fuzzy anyway, which I don't think anybody had ever come up with a really good definition for. So I know we like to put things in these nice little places, but in reality, everything that we discuss is always far more nuanced than a binary decision, for better or worse. I think that keeps it interesting.
Absolutely.
Thank you. I also wanted to I wanted to point out that I really appreciate you guys. I know how Twitter can escalate things with the short character counts. We had a little bit of an outburst over the font souls thing, but nobody cited Kenneth as saying to stalk people, and I think that's really good because that could have been taken out of context pretty badly. So I'm glad you guys are paying attention to the things that the other things we're saying. That's good. So Kenneth, thank you.
Thank you.